Hello, friends. We are excited that our No Small Endeavor Plus community is growing. Now, all of our friends in the No Small Endeavor orbit are intelligent, smarter than average, winsome, good-looking, while the members of NSC Plus seem especially so because they are enjoying ad-free episodes as well as special subscriber-only content once a month where we discuss habits and practices learned from our guests over the years. And those special episodes have been a lot of fun, personal and practical. I love sitting down with our producer, Jacob Lewis, and recording those for you. And so we would love to have you join us. And your NSC Plus membership helps support the show. So because of all of these things, we'd love for you to join the NSC Plus family. Just go to nosmallendeavor.com, click subscribe, and start catching up on our subscriber-only episodes today. Again, go now, nosmallendeavor.com, click subscribe, and start catching up. See you there. Hello, friends. Lee C. Camp here, No Small Endeavor. Excited to share this special unabridged interview of Martin Sheen with you. I've gotten to meet a lot of fascinating, wonderful human beings in the line of work I'm in, some of them famous and some not. Martin Sheen is obviously among the celebrity crowd. I'd worked my way into some letter writing and phone calls with Mr. Sheen, and after a bit of back and forth over a couple of years, actually, he consented to me coming to his house in Malibu to tape an interview. My wife Laura and I have been particularly big fans of his work as President Jed Bartlet on the television series The West Wing, and I also had been following his activism and peace work for years and knew that he was well connected in the peace movement in the United States, and so I was also a fan of his in that regard. So I was pretty excited about it. And yet I was also cautious. I've discovered that there is some truth to that old conventional wisdom about it being better to never meet your own heroes. And I had learned that through a painful episode or two. So, cautious. But when I pulled up to his house, there was Martin Sheen, having just come out to open up his gate for me. I rolled down my window. He said, "Are you Lee?" And I said, "Yes." And I said, "Are you Mr. Sheen?" And he said, "Yes." And he said, "Come on in. I've made you a pot of coffee." And we went inside. He showed me around, talked about his kids and his grandkids, talked about the art on the walls. And then we sat down and taped this interview. And after it was over, he asked me if I wanted to go to Mass with him, which I did. And we just made an evening of it all. It was a delightful time. As soon as I was done with the evening, I texted my wife and my sons to show them a selfie I had made with Martin Sheen. And my wife immediately asked me, "Did you tell him that I'm a big fan like I asked you to?" And I shamefacedly had to admit that I did not. So this interview got me in some hot water with my beloved wife because I had failed to do that. So after I came home, our producer, Jacob Lewis, has given me a manual typewriter, which I've learned to love writing letters that way. And so I typed Martin a letter on the old manual typewriter. And I confessed that I had gotten myself in hot water with my wife. And I wanted him to know that she was a big fan of him as President Bartlet on the West Wing. About a week later, a big package came in the mail. And therein was a small photograph of Martin Sheen, to me, signed by Martin Sheen. And there was a large publicity photo of Martin Sheen as President Jed Bartlet on the West Wing, signed very lovingly to my wife, Laura. It was a delightful and has been a delightful experience. Hope you enjoy this interview. It's really, I think, very special and quite beautiful. Enjoy. Born in Ohio, children of immigrants.
Yeah. Both my parents were immigrants. My father was from Spain and my mother from Ireland. You know my real name?
Yes. What would you say it for us?
Ramon Gerardo Esteves.
Esteves.
Well, my father was a Gallego from Galicia, and so they had the very strong TH sound. Gracias por nada.
Yeah.
So
I'm from Alabama. I can hardly do foreign accents. My German teacher mocked me in seminary years because my Alabama accent was so bad.
Were you ordained?
So yeah, well, that's a long story. Yes is the short answer. Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But, so do you think that? When you think back about your family and being the child of immigrants, in what ways do you think what are some of the elements of your childhood experience that you think have informed both faith and activism in your life?
Oh, they're absolutely inseparable. Both of my parents were very devout Catholics. You know, my mother had 12 pregnancies. 10 survived, 9 boys, 1 girl. So, and my father came from a large family. My mother came from a pretty large Irish family. But they both had great difficulty coming here to the United States. My mother was actually sent to the United States in 1921. Her family were supporters of independence, so they were very strong IRA supporters, and her brother was in the military, actively engaged. And of the whole family were basically. And at the end of the war with England, when they were settling on, you know, what it was going to be, the Civil War broke out because there were the non-treaty and the treaty folks. Right. And so my grandparents didn't know how it was going to turn out, and they were kind of hedging their bets. So they sent my mother to live with a cousin in Ohio in 1921. She was 18. And await the outcome of the Civil War, which took 2 years of it to 1923. Of course, the De Valera succeeded, and Mick Collins was killed. So the rebels lost, and my family were on the side of the rebels. So she stayed. She stayed with a cousin, and then she met my dad. She decided to become a citizen, and in those days, you went to citizenship school, and all the immigrants went together. And she met this fiery young Spaniard, she called him, and he couldn't speak English. He spoke Spanish and Portuguese and Italian, but he didn't speak English. So she basically taught him English, and that's how they got together. And they were married in Dayton in 1927, and they started raising a family. And then he was working for the National Cash Register Company when he started, and that's headquartered in Dayton, Ohio. And he got an opportunity to go to South America, to Colombia and Bogota. And so they packed up and went to Bogota. And she was pregnant and lost a child in Bogota. She was never comfortable there because it was very high altitude. I've never been to Colombia, but she couldn't bear it. She got pregnant again and was afraid she'd lose another one. And so at the same time, her mother was ill back in Ireland, and she decided to go back and spend some time with her. So my oldest brother, Manuel, his name was Manuel Noel Esteves, was born in that village you see in that picture in Borisacane, County Tipperary. And then meanwhile, my father left a job in Colombia and got a job with the NCR and the Toledo scale company as a repairman. He could repair anything but that. The TV. That's the only thing he couldn't repair. And so they got back together in Bermuda, in Hamilton, Bermuda. And that's where the next 5 kids were born. And then the war broke out in 1940. And with 39, actually, with Europe. U.S., of course, wasn't in it yet, but Europe was on fire. And there was a lot of U-boat activity. And Bermuda was a British possession, still is, basically. And so they were in jeopardy. And so they decided to return to Dayton. And that's where I was born in 1940.
Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So growing up, I guess, as far as early childhood activism experience, I've read a story about you as a caddy that may be the origins of your social activism.
I was working for Senator Brown in Ohio some time ago, and I told him that story, and that's his favorite story. He always tells people, "Did you know that Martin was a union organizer at the age of 14?" And
we tell that story for us.
Well, I was working at a very exclusive private club in Dayton, and they were extremely, how should I say, they were a bunch of airheads, basically. They were racist and then anti-Semite, and they were against anything that wasn't white, strictly American, and they worshiped the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus, who was probably born somewhere in Indiana. Who knows? And so, I started working. All my brothers in front of me were caddies, and so it kind of fell on the mantle that you take this up. And so in the summer of 1949, I started caddying there. I was actually 8 years old. I turned 9, and my birthday's in August. So from there on until every year until I left home in 1959, from early spring till late fall, we would caddy. After school in the spring, when I was in grade school, even in high school, we would go to the golf course and caddy, and particularly during the hot summer months of June, July, and August, it was every day but Monday. That was caddy day. You had the day off. They closed the club, and the caddies were allowed to play. But that was my growing up experience and my childhood experience and my real community bonding, really, with the lads. And so I was caddying there for about 5 years at the time, and they treated us, like servants, but that kind of elitism, you don't want to know the name of the servants. So it was just caddy this and caddy that. And we were judged on our etiquette and our skills, of course, and we would placate these idiots. We would club them. Do you know what that term means?
No.
It doesn't mean to hit them over the head. I almost wish we could have done that with the golf club. But club them means we would advise them what club to use in the circumstance, because we knew the golf course, from every nook and cranny. We could tell where the approach to the pins and what club to use and blah, blah, blah. It's endless. And so we were judged on those kind of skills. But the fundamental understanding was, you're a servant, then don't get too personal with these people. You could be a little more personal with the wives. The women were a little less ostentatious. They were more down to earth. They knew, for the most part, their husbands were a bunch of jerks. But the husbands took themselves very seriously, and they played for a lot of money, and they would talk about each other in front of us. With such...
Like your wallpaper, I guess.
Oh, my God, and with such vulgarity. That's why I don't use the F word unless it's mandatory in a film like Apocalypse Now or some deal like that. It's not part of my vocabulary. And because I heard that word as a child spoken in my presence by adult men, primarily, and I said, I don't want to be like them ever. So I'm grateful to them. They taught me a whole lot of very important lessons about what not to be. Very few of them were heroic. A couple of them were, I'll grant them that. But at that summer of 1954, I believe it was, because I remember the Rosenbergs were about to be executed, and there was a very great concern and among all of us, who were conscious about what was going on, that hopefully Eisenhower would stop the executions, which he did not. But I was that conscious, and I used that as an example of how aware I was of what was going on at the time. And so we were very concerned about the Rosenbergs and what was the point in killing these two people. And so that was the level of one kind of the temperature of my awareness. Okay. And I was raised in a Catholic grade school from 6th grade till 8th grade, and then I went into high school, a Catholic, all-boys Catholic high school by the Mariners called Chaminade in Dayton. And so I think I was a freshman, about to go into my sophomore year at that time. I would have been 14. So yeah, I would have been just going into my freshman year, I believe, because I graduated at 18. Okay, I'm sorry if I'm digressing here. But I decided that, the boys were always complaining about how badly they were treated, how little money they made for how much work they did, And mind you, we would, most golf courses are not flat. They're hills and dales. And so you're carrying, generally speaking, if you're carrying doubles, it's 2 bags, you're serving 2 guys at the same time, and you're walking up some of those hills, you're walking 4 miles with like, in some case, 80 pounds on your back. And you would get, at that time, the most you could make was $4.25. If you got the 75-cent tip with a fin, we call it a fin, it's a fiver, that you were lucky. But a lot of them, man, and sometimes at the end of the day, you'd come in and they'd go in the clubhouse and start playing cards and getting drunk, and you'd wait out there until after dark before they realized, they'd be coming out to go home, and you're sitting there waiting for them to pay you. That was normal. And they'd say, oh, Skeezix, sorry about that. Oh, hey, yeah, sorry. And they'd dig in their pockets for something, for enough to pay you. But so we decided to end that. We wanted to be treated as human beings, and we wanted to be paid for our labor. Because normally, on any given day, you would carry 2 bags for up and down hills and dales for 36 holes. You got 18 for this group in the morning and 18 for this group in the afternoon. That was normal. On the weekends, it was mandatory. Yeah. And so we wanted more dough, and we wanted to be treated with respect, and like that. So that was the issue, and they refused to budge. They wouldn't even talk to us. So I called the lads out and said, if we're going to get their attention, we have to strike. And the best way to do it is on a Tuesday, because that's ladies' day, and the ladies are not going to carry their own bags, They'd expect you to meet them at the parking lot and escort them to the thing, and, Sorry. And so, so we walked out. The caddy master came and said, "Skeezer, what's going on?" I said, "Well, we're not working today. I told you, we have grievances here. We want to do." "Oh, man, come on, lad, don't listen to him, And it went on, and it went on for about 4 or 5 days, I remember. And it got down to where gradually they destroyed our ranks, and it got down to 2 guys, my brother, Alfonso, and I. And finally I looked at him one day, I said, well, and they threw us off the course. Oh. It was the first time since I'd worked there in 5 years, almost 6 years, where I heard the term applied to us, "You're on private property." All this time, no one ever said, "You're on private property. Now get off. You're going to call the police." Okay. So we were not allowed to picket there or congregate there. We had to have our meetings down the road off the property of the golf course. And so it ended with Al finally saying, "Brother, I think it's a lost cause, but, I'm proud of you. If you want to go, I'll support you."
You learned early about the machinations of power.
Very much so, yeah. So we caved in. I came back, and they asked me to come back, actually, because I was a very good caddy. All of us were. And they were losing some really skilled labor. So I swallowed my pride, and I went back. But that lesson was the first one that I made a profound change.
Formative.
Very formative.
Formative experience. Yeah. So you've talked publicly about kind of wandering away or letting go of or not taking seriously, I'm not sure the language there, your faith for some time. Mm-hmm. And then...
It's called ego.
Yeah.
Ego, here you go.
But was it, do I remember correctly that it was about the time you were filming the Gandhi film in India that was a kind of a important time of you beginning to come back to your faith, or what were some of the key elements?
Well, that was the culmination of a couple of years. That was in 81. But in 77, I was in the Philippines finishing up the last couple of months of Apocalypse. And I found myself alone one night, and I thought I was having a heart attack. And I got very, very sick, and I guess I nearly died. And I had it was a wake-up call, that I realized that I needed to get balanced more. I was so egocentric and so career-oriented, and so afraid of everything, basically, that that I couldn't understand. It was very hard for me to accept, that when you're that young, I was 36, 37 at the time. And, it was the first big job of my life. And I knew that I was going to be, if I survived, I was going to be more in demand, and I could make a living doing this thing. And so I ought not blow this opportunity. But at the same time, I was so splintered. I was so scattered, and I needed to find a way to bring all the pieces back together. That's the best way I can explain it. And because I was so fragmented, I was this person, I was this way with this person, and that way with this person, and with myself, I was so torn and divided. I was ineffective doing anything with family or career or anything. And I was not leading basically a very honest life, really a very dishonest life, frankly. And Janet, on the other hand, we married almost 20 years by then, was just always a straight, honest person. And for me, honesty was a sometimes thing, She couldn't count on me, but I could always count on her. And I decided after that wake-up call, I had to find a way to get to a level of understanding or freedom or honesty, whatever you want to call it. I don't think you can separate them. And so it really started to get clear when I went to India with Emilio in January of 81 to do a part on Gandhi. And I had been in some third world countries like the Philippines and Mexico and a few others that I saw horrible poverty, but I'd never seen institutionalized poverty like that. I mean, it was just so accepted, and there was so much. It was horrible. I mean, it was poverty on top of poverty. It was like there was no end to it. It was generational, and it foreclosed the future, it seemed. And then it began to strike me, and one part of it was that all of these, and we would be in crowds. I was in a crowd at one point. They estimate about 1 million people in the scene, the opening scene of Gandhi's funeral.
Yeah.
And to just be a part of that enormous size of humanity. And I thought, you will never see these people again, ever. And of course you don't, and that's becomes pretty much the course every day in the third world. You're never going to see them again. They can't come where you live, and you can leave anytime because you got an old USA passport. And that made a profound imprint on me. And I decided that I really needed to make an adjustment in my life. And I remember that some members of the cast, including myself, had gotten together and made a donation to Mother Teresa. And she let the company know that we could come and visit in Calcutta. And so I remember coming back to the hotel and telling Emilio, "Oh man, next week we're invited. We can go down to Calcutta." We were in Delhi at the time, and meet Mother Teresa. And Emilio said, "Who?" I said, "Come on, man, Mother Teresa." He said, "I know who she is. Well, why do you want to meet her?" I said, "So I can tell never mind. That's the only reason I wanted to meet her, so I could brag about it." And so I didn't go.
Huh.
And when I did meet her years later, I told her the story, and she laughed. I met her almost exactly five years to the day later. At any rate, I came home from India with a very kind of vacuum of what the next thing I would do. And I remember I brought home some books from India about Indian culture and about, the spirituality and so forth. And one of the books talked about how one of the theories of the culture was that we wake up in death. We don't just die and kind of forgotten, but they believe that you realize who you are when you die. You wake up and say, "Oh, I was so-and-so, and I was in America at that time. Oh, I see what I do. Now what's this?" So it's a reincarnation, right?
Yeah.
And I thought that was really interesting, and I brought that book home, and when I came home, Janet says, well, we've been trying to reach you. In India, in those days, there's no cell phones. And so I'd gotten an offer to go to Paris and do this film. And I had kind of said, yeah, okay, fine. But the line went dead and they didn't call back. And I wasn't sure what, and nobody could reach you. And I thought, it's not going to happen, I guess. I came home. She said, you're supposed to be in Paris. I said, oh my God, no. And so I had to turn around literally the next day and head to Paris to do this film. And I had to explain, yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't have a working phone in India. And so I started working on this little film, and I remember Sam Neill was in it, and I was so impressed with his character. He was living at a hotel called the Hotel Lennox, and he said, you ought to come over there and see if you can get a room. And so I came over to this place. It was in the left bank, and he took me up and he showed me this magnificent, he had kind of a 2-story room on the top of the hotel, this little tiny hotel on the left bank. And he said, and I said, wow, I'd like to go. And I went down in the desk and no, we don't have any rooms let. And he said, you can have mine. I said, oh, no. He said, and he did, he moved out and he insisted I move in, and I did. And it became like, for me, a monastery. And I just loved this room. And it was like there was a skylight, and I'd wake up in the mornings, I'd order a cappuccino and a croissant, they'd bring the paper, and I'd read, and I'd on the terrace, and it was just, and I had all these books I had to read. And then one day I was walking down the Rue Jacob, and I see a guy on the other side of the street, and he sees me, and we recognize each other instantly. And I said, Terry, is that you? And he said, Martin, is that you? I said, he's from Texas, Oklahoma. I said, yeah. Well, what are you doing here? I said, well, I'm doing a little filming. I said, what are you doing here? He said, well, you're just kind of, reevaluating my life, and I've been remarried, and I'm living here, and I'm writing script and all that. And we started talking, and we talked for like the next 3 months, almost every day.
And this is Terrence Malick.
This is Terrence Malick, yeah. He became, for lack of a better phrase, and I know he wouldn't approve of it, but he became like a spiritual advisor. He's a very, very deeply spiritual man, and he Rhodes Scholar, of course. He spoke 4 languages and had this thirst for the spirituality that he lived. And we talked endlessly. And he would take me. He showed me Paris, and I learned all of Paris. I learned on the subway in the correspondance, you get off here and go in there. And I'd learn Paris, and I'd walk everywhere. And he said, well, we're going to go to the Ile-de-France. We're going to go here and there. We're going to go to the Shakespeare and Company. He'd give me books to read all the time, endlessly. And we'd discuss the books after I read them. And the film that I was doing, I can't even remember the name, God forgive me. And I hope that Sam Neill will forgive me. But it was an annoyance. I had to go to work every day, every now and then, do a few days on the film, because I was so engaged in this revelatory reawakening of our friendship, and the effect it was having on me. And the last book he gave me from Shakespeare and Company, do you know what that Shakespeare and Company is in Paris? It's a very famous bookstore. It's 2 or 3 stories high. I think it just closed because the owner passed away recently during the pandemic. I'm not sure, but it was a meeting place. I mean, Hemingway went there, and it's a landmark in Paris. And it's an English-speaking bookstore. You can get French books there too, I suppose. But and he would take me there, and he'd pull down books. Martin, I think you should read this. And look, here it is for you. And I'd go out of there with books. And the last book he gave me was The Brothers Karamazov.
Oh my!
And I started reading it, and I could not stop reading it. And pretty thick book, and I read it thoroughly in 5 or 6 days. And by the end of it, coincidentally, I had a day off. It was May 1st. It was May Day in Europe, so it's like our Labor Day here in America. So it was a holiday. The film shut down for the day, and I had the day off. And I woke up the morning after I finished reading The Brothers Karamazov, and I said, well, I guess this is the day. And I walked from the Lenox Hotel on the left bank across the river, and all the way over to the right bank to this church called St. Joseph on the Avenue Hoche, which is not far from the Arc de Triomphe and the right bank. And because I used to go there occasionally. It was an English-speaking church. It was the only one in Paris, and I learned later it was really the only one in all of France, English-speaking church. And it was serviced by these redemptionist fathers from Ireland. So it was in English. And every now and then I used to stop in there because before I got the room at that Sam gave me at the Hotel Le Lynx, I was staying at the Hotel Moreau. And it was just it just wasn't a very comfortable place for me. So occasionally I would just drop in this church, and I saw this guy preach every now and then. It's interesting. I'd light a candle, stuff like that, from my early life as a Catholic. And I had this intention that I needed to get back to my foundation. I needed to start living an honest life, because now I understood how important it was. Because to lead a dishonest life is the death of the soul, basically. You can't serve two masters. You can't serve the flesh and your spirit. You have to find a way to unite the will of the spirit to the work of the flesh, I say, in order to lead an honest life. And so I realized how important it was. And for me, I wanted to return to the Catholic Church, which had changed so drastically from the time I left it, with Vatican II. Yeah. And I wanted to join the church that served human rights, social justice, and peace, and the Church of Mother Teresa and Dan Berrigan, and Pope John the 23rd, who started the whole thing. And so I marched over there on May Day, 1981, and I found that church, and I banged on the door. It was around noon o'clock, and I banged on the door. And I banged again on the door. No answer, no answer, no answer. I finally, last-ditch effort, roused somebody there, and I hammered on the door like Martin Luther must have done back in the day, and no answer. And so I walked down the steps. And by the time I got to the bottom of the steps, I heard the door fly open, and I look up, and there's that guy, that redemptionist priest. And he had a napkin, and he had a little food on his chin, and it was like I knew I had interrupted his lunch. He said, "What is it? What's going on?" I said, Oh, Father, I'm sorry to bother you. I haven't been to confession in many years, and I'd like to go to confession. And he looked at me, and something behind his eyes said, this is what I do for a living. You came to the right place, not to worry. And he said, can you come tomorrow? It's Saturday at noon o'clock, and we'll do that. And I said, I'd be delighted. And he said, don't be late. I have a wedding at 1 o'clock. I said, I won't. And that was it. I came back the next day at the appointed hour, and I was the only one in the church. It was stone empty. And I went in the box. He came out, and I went in the box. And I went to confession. And he gave me, and it's been a long time, and he gave me a penance. You know what confession is, right? Yeah. He gave me a penance. He said, now I want you to say 1 Our Father. And I said, 1 Our Father? And he said, yes. He said, you haven't been gone that long that you've forgotten the Our Father. And I said, no, I remember, and I'm just a little surprised. Yeah, just say that, and I'll make a good act of contrition. And I did. And he left the box, and I walked out into the empty church. I burst into tears. I wept with a measure of joy that I had never experienced before. And it still moves me to talk about it, to remember it. I wept with such joy and such relief. And I was so happy to be home. I'd finally gotten back home. And I remember sitting in the pew, and the tears were flooding my face, and the snot was pouring out of my nose. And I went looking in my pocket for something to wipe all this away, and there was nothing. And I looked down on the floor, and there was somebody had dropped a Kleenex there, and I grabbed it and soaked my face in it. It was all I had. It was the happiest day of my life, because I'd returned to my true self. And I began to become myself, basically. And I resolved to serve, and that was it. And I don't know what else to say. That was 41 years ago. Yeah, it's been the most difficult decision and the hardest time imaginable. but equally the happiest. And it's not an easy thing because you're called on, you start hanging out with people like Dan Berrigan and John Deere and
Yeah, so I'd like to kind of
James Lawson, and you're not going to be,
turn to some of that. Well, first, thank you for sharing that. That's beautiful. Thank you. And so out of that, then you have a strong heritage in the Catholic tradition, Catholic social teaching. Then that makes sense of the way your activism is grounded, is inseparable from your faith going forward, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And you've been arrested, 60-something times in your social activism work?
I only started keeping count because of my age. I thought, I got a lot of work to do here. But I couldn't really separate any of the issues from whether it was homelessness or nuclearism, which was the state religion, basically. We were arming because we didn't trust God, and we were not nonviolent. We were extremely armed and dangerous, and nuclearism had to be confronted. And so I got involved in the anti-nuke movement through the Berrigans, basically.
And you were very close friends with Dan Berrigan? I
was. He was my hero. Yeah. Very much.
For those who don't know much about Dan and Phil Berrigan, would you just very briefly give kind of a snapshot of some of their work?
Well, they were two Catholic priests. Dan Berrigan was a Jesuit, and his brother Phil was a Josephite. The Josephite brothers, and incidentally, Phil was a World War II combat veteran. And
I didn't remember that.
Yeah, he came home from the service and followed his vocation, was ordained, and he started serving in the South. And so he got a pretty good taste of, this is way back in the day, in the 50s and so forth, where he saw the Josephites were trying to level the field against racism in the South, basically. They had schools and missions that served basically black people. They weren't all Catholic. They didn't have to be, but they had a need, and the church had a mission to serve. They still do. The Josephites are basically in service to black Americans. That's their primary mission. And then Dan was a Jesuit and was a scholar and a poet and a very revered Jesuit. And they became friends with the birth of pacifism in the United States, really, in the modern era, from a monk in Louisville, Kentucky, who was Thomas Merton. Merton had begun publishing the hellish presence of the bomb, and he began to raise the awareness within the Catholic world, within the conscious world, of what the bomb was doing to us and how it had deadened our spirits, and we begun to depend on the bomb rather than God in Christian sense. And so that focus was very, very intense. And they came together on it, and it culminated with the war in Vietnam. And they started early protests and burning of draft cards and so forth, and speaking out against the war. Both of them were convicted of there was a landmark decision in I'm trying to think where it was, in Maryland, I believe it was. The first confrontation they had with the draft board. Catonsville. They were the Catonsville Nine, and they went to prison. And Dan almost died in prison, and they served a few years and came out, and they were a great source of inspiration to a lot of us in the movement. And I remember something Dan said while he was awaiting, after he was captured and was on his way to prison. They had kind of a goodbye gathering for his friends and family and all. And someone asked him, Dan said, the only way we're going to end this war is if we fill the prisons. That's the only way that the government is going to realize that this is going to end. We're going to end it. We're just not going to participate. And if it means that we have to protest so that they put us in, let's fill the prisons and instead of the graveyards of Southeast Asia. Mm. And someone in the audience said, well, that's all well and good, Father Berrigan, for you to advocate our going to prison. We have children. What about our children? What's going to happen to our children if we go to jail? And Dan said, what's going to happen to them if you don't? Mm. And that's where the truth lies, right? And so Dan and Phil had this peace and justice advocacy, which crossed all the lines in the church and all areas of the culture, really, but specifically in the peace and justice movement within the Catholic Church in Pax Christi and some of the others, very specific Catholic attention to peacemaking during the Cold War and specifically during the Vietnam War, which is critical. So I met, Dan and they had both been an inspiration to me, but I hadn't met either until I came back to the church. And I was offered in 1981, shortly that summer after I'd reconverted in Paris, that summer, I was invited to come to New York to do a documentary with a very radical filmmaker named Emilio D'Antonio. He was making a film based on another action that the Berrigan brothers had led in the King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, where they barged into a General Electric plant there that builds and assembles the MX-12 missiles. And they banged on the nose cones of these missiles with hammers and poured their blood on them. They were fulfilling the prophecy of they shall beat their swords into plowshares and so forth. And so they called themselves the Plowshares. And Emilio D'Antonio got the trial record. They were all convicted, but they were on appeal, and he wanted to do a documentary. But he wanted the participants, the defendants, to play themselves, and he asked me to play the judge, Judge Kaufman. Well, I said, I would love to do that, and I had planned to go. And then, unexpectedly, one of my heroes, who happened to be my oldest living brother at the time, suddenly died here in Los Angeles. And so I was delayed, and I called them and said, I'm going to be delayed getting there. And they said, okay. And meanwhile, we prepared for my brother's funeral, and my other brother, Alfonso, he's gone now, to God rest them all. And I had to go and make the arrangements here in Los Angeles. And we went to the funeral parlor. I remember the two of us are sitting there, and the guy says, okay, would you like to identify the body? And we looked at each other. I didn't want a memory of my brother already deceased, He was very lively. He was one of my heroes. He was a wonderful man. And his greatest delight was that I had recently returned to the church. He was over the moon about that. He was practicing Catholic, But he was very ill. He'd lost a leg and so forth. And so we asked, we said, well, is the body got one leg? And they said, yeah. And he says, the guy looked like he's maybe 47, 48. And they said, yeah. And we said, that's him. Well, what do you want, a suit? They said, no, a shroud will do, fine. And just really plain. That was it. Huh. And he said, do you want a holy card? A prayer card? You know what that is? Where you get a little card that gives you the name of the deceased with the date of birth. And we said, yeah, we'd like one. And they said, okay. So he spread out 6 or 8 of them on the desk. And he said, well, you can choose one of these. And I was looking at one, and I was looking at the name of this young, I assume he was young because he was born and died at a very young age, 20, 21. And he had a Asian name. And I said, has this man been buried? Oh, yes, he said. I said, what is this story with that? And he said, yes, he was a young Chinese student who came, and he didn't do well, and he committed suicide, unfortunately. And that's his prayer card. And I said, oh my, well, could I keep this? And he said, yeah, well, sure, okay. So I said, we'll have one for Mike like this. Okay, fine. And I put it in my belongings, and I remember I got to New York, and I was being prepared for the first take in the King of Prussia, the documentary film. I hadn't met anybody yet, but Emil D'Antonio, the director, was trying to get me suited up and he gave me a Bible. And I looked at the Bible and it was a King James version. I said, did the defendants know which Bible we're using? And they said, it doesn't matter. And I said, okay, fine. And so I put this kid's prayer card into the Bible, and I just left it there. And so there came a break in the proceedings, and Dan Berrigan came up and he said, Martin, good to meet you. And I said, it's a pleasure to meet you, Father Berrigan.
So this was the first time you met?
First time I met him, yeah. I'm sitting on the bench playing Judge Kaufman, and he's playing himself. And there's a break in the proceedings. And he came up, and he started looking at the Bible, King James. He had a great sense of humor, and he started looking through it, and he saw the card. And he pulled it out, and he said, oh my, who is this? And I told him the story I just told you, and he said, okay. And he took a pen and he wrote down the name, and he said, I'll pray for him. Put it back, and that was our first meeting.
Wow.
Yeah. So there you have it. So, I mean, you had the sense that, when you're going to meet Dan Berrigan, after all you've heard about him, he's got to be at least 8 feet tall, right? Yeah, but here was this very slight, very handsome, thin, kind of frail guy with this great energy and this magnificent sense of humor, and overall, he was just so disarming. He was like this brilliant mind, and but his measure of compassion was just like, and his sense of humor was he was so funny. When we're having a mass, John Deere was there to mass. They used to live in community on 98th Street up in New York and Upper West Side. There was a Jesuit community there, that served, and the universities and chapels and hospitals and so forth. And Dan was in that community. And they'd invite us to Mass every now and then. We were in New York. And we went to Mass there. John and I went to a Mass. Dan said a Mass on Ascension Thursday, which is a holy day. And after the gospel, Dan is giving a homily, and he begins with, Ascension Thursday, gone but not forgotten. That's the kind of humor, these guys had. It was just unbelievable. There was a story, I didn't see it, but I heard it, and I think I remember saying it to him, and he kind of smiled and nodded, but he was speaking at a very conservative Catholic church, and he got up in the pulpit to speak, and there was an American flag on his right and the papal flag on his left. And he looked at both of them and he said to the crowd, well, now I have a sense how Jesus felt being crucified between two thieves. The Vatican didn't hold a lot of promise for Dan, Well, in the building where he lived, there was an ancient couple. They adored him, and they were always, very polite and everything. And they were curious one day. They stopped him and said, we've known you all these years, and you're still a priest. Do you think you're going to advance in this situation? They were serious. And he said, oh, no, I don't think so. I'm fine as I am.
So that raises a question, because John Deere describes Dan Berrigan the same way, with a sort of joyful spirit, wonderful sense of humor. And so when I've gotten to spend, I'm now, into my second hour with you today, first time ever.
Really? I'm such a windbag. You won't get a word in edgewise.
Not on an interview, but since I showed up at your house here, and, you strike me as a joyous...
I did not strike you. Yeah. No, that's good. I'm still a very...
You impressed me as a joyous human being. And so I think a lot of times when people will think about social justice activists, one of the stereotypes is a sort of kind of sharp edge, but you seem to have this sort of sweetness about you, and Dan sounds like he has a sweetness about him. So how do you see the sort of social activism that requires you to take this kind of strong stance vis-a-vis the powers of the world, and the sort of joy that you carry around?
Well, it's from the time I came back to the church, I felt a rejuvenation in my life of when I started. As a child, I had a sense of, and I still have a remembrance of it now, because, I was raised in a Catholic family and a Catholic school, and I remember those early days in first and second grade, and they're preparing you for communion and what's this all about, and there was a sense of knowingness, and I can't really describe it anymore. Knowingness. There's a knowingness about the mystery. The children have a sense of mystery, and it's all deeply personal. You're best dealing with it with another child or another bunch of children. You play games or you talk about things, and they understand, they get it. And there's this great mystery about, this adventure we're all kind of on, Most of the kids that I knew, in fact, all of them were poor and lived in, their parents their fathers particularly, were working class. They were plumbers and painters and electricians and such, construction workers and all. Nobody went to college. I mean, it just wasn't heard of at the time. And we were all expected to go into the working world. But there was a sense of the mystery of it all, that seemed to be the equalizer, that there was something mysterious, that we had an innate kind of appreciation for, knowledge of, or acceptance. I think it's an acceptance, and it was a knowingness. And so you would see it in others. You'd say, what is that with that guy? What is that with that lady or that girl or that person? Or why are they this and that? It was like the people attracted you more by what they were doing than what they were saying. That you watched people, some of the older people in our parish were just, they were so heroically contribute. They served. The nuns, we had the Sisters of Notre Dame, and they were so compassionate. And I hear stories about how so many kids who grew up Catholic and had nuns for teachers, how they were so unkind and beat them up and all. Well, they probably had it coming. I know we did, But we had these extraordinary women who came from the same families. Their fathers were bricklayers and painters and plumbers and whatnot, like our parents were. So they knew where we were. And so, you get on the lunch line, you didn't have any money, they knew it, and they would slip you a ticket and say, and they never made you feel like they were doing anything out of the ordinary. So they were heroically compassionate. And I think that was the thing that attracted me so much to Catholicism, was this human spirituality, this deep sense of what it meant to be human. And there's only one word for it, and that's compassion. You saw it in these people that were teaching us, and these people that were parenting us, and you saw it in people everywhere, like the boys' club. You just go to the boys' club, and they weren't Catholic. It didn't matter. They were people who understood the mystery of what it meant to be human, and that's that magic word, heroically compassionate, I call it. And you knew when you didn't see it, like a lot of those wretched poor devils at the golf course, they didn't have an ounce of compassion. If they had it, I didn't see much of it in their when I was in their presence. So I just had that sense, like I kind of knew something that was deeply personal, and it was a knowingness. And when I came, and I left it, when I got to New York, and I'm, suddenly started to get recognized and started making a living for this thing I love to do, and started to get recognized. I thought, oh, that's it. I'm the mystery. I'm what it's all about here. Okay, fine. And then when I ended up in the toilet, crawling around on the floor of the jungle in the Philippines, trying to find my way to the road, I realized, that's what it leads to, And so I knew that I had lost the compassion for myself, And so it was a natural progression to return to the church, because I never really left it in that sense. How people always say, well, I'm looking for God. No. God already found you. It's like it's right there, It's right there. And it's like the older I get, and the more dependent I become on accepting my frailties and my mortality, my humanity, the more I appreciate that I came to understand what it meant to love myself. It was the recognition that I was loved. And that's what I give thanks and praise for every day when I remember. But our prayer is our life.
Yeah.
I remember, I'm laughing now because we have a mutual connection, and dear Ethel Kennedy, who's one of my heroes. And mind you, I would never call her Ethel in her presence. It was always Mrs. Kennedy. And we were at supper one night, and I had just read Richard Rohr's book. And I was saying, Mrs. Kennedy, had you heard this wonderful theological lesson from Richard Rohr about heaven? Oh, no. She said, what's that? And I said, well, Richard Rohr says that we don't go to heaven, we become heaven. And she said, oh, no, I'm not having that. I intend to go to heaven. I don't want to hear it. I said, no, it meant, no, I know what you mean. I don't want to hear it. It was so funny. Oh, God, I adore her.
So I've got several stories. I still want to try to find time for us to get in.
Okay.
You end up in jail one day with Jim Lawson.
Yes. Oh my God.
Would you tell us that story?
I'm only reluctant because it sounds like I'm bragging, and I am. Yeah. I promise you. John and
I'm inviting you.
Okay. Well, John and I were arrested. John Deere and I were arrested. We had belonged to a coalition of laity and clergy concerned here in Los Angeles against the war in El Salvador in Central America. And when the Jesuits were murdered, our protest became very intense. And we began to meet, and we formed a group called the Wednesday Morning Coalition of all of religious and laity concerned. Mostly Catholic, but not confined to Catholic. There were a lot of ministers and of all religions and rabbis who joined us. And we would assemble downtown in LA at La Placita, in the little church there, and we would march to the federal courthouse, and we would shut it down every Wednesday morning. They'd see us coming. We were totally nonviolent, but we would, it was a serious intent, but we came with great compassion and not without humor, and we would chain ourselves so they couldn't get in the doors. We'd get there before anybody else, like 7 o'clock in the morning. And so, by the time they were ready to open, they couldn't get the door. So they would arrest us, and went on for, I remember I went to court finally for 13 arrests, that I had to account for, and I couldn't remember having had that many. But at any rate, on one of them, we ended up in the basement of that building, which was a holding cell for undocumented. And it was a huge room, and they had us all in there, handcuffed and seated on the floor. We were required to sit on the floor. And John and I were sitting next to each other and on the floor, and our hands behind our backs, handcuffed. And the door would open every now and then. There was a huge room, and more people would be brought in and joined us. And by the whole room, rectangular room, was filled with all the protesters. And at one point, John said, "Hey, don't look now, but you see that guy over there?" I said, "Who's that?" She said, "The guy on the other side. I think that's James Lawson." I said, "Who?" He said, "Reverend James Lawson." And he told me the story of how Reverend Lawson led the protest in Memphis for the garbage strikers. And he encouraged Reverend King to come to Memphis. And they were very, very close friends. And that was their relationship, and that he was the hero of Memphis and one of the great heroes of the nonviolent movement. And I said, "Oh my God, that's him." Then I remembered seeing footage of him during the civil rights protests and so forth, and how close he was to Reverend King. And there he was, right across from us. And so I didn't, we're confined there. There was no social socializing, except you talk to the person right or left. At any rate, by and by, Reverend Lawson inched his way up the wall with his hands behind his back, and he was kind of stretching there and trying to, get more comfortable. And the guard came in and said, "You get down, on the floor. You're not allowed to stand up now. Get down on the floor." And he said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I'm talking to you, mister. You get your ass on the floor, and the quicker the better. And I'm not going to tell you again." And Reverend King says, "Excuse me, if you don't mind." He said, "You get back on the floor, mister." And he said, "Please listen to me." He said, I'm having a great deal of pain in my shoulders and my hands are numb and I can't sit on the floor anymore. So respectfully, I'm going to stand." He said, "Mister, I'm telling you for the last time, you better get your on the floor and do it now." And Reverend King says, "Again, I have to tell you, seriously, I'm in a lot of pain. Please forgive me. I don't mean to disobey your rules here, but I cannot." I'm paraphrasing what he was saying. And the guy says, okay, I warned you. That's it. And he left. He said, "I'm coming back, and you better be where I tell you to." No. And there was a silence, and then there was a palpable concern about what was the next move. Everybody, there was dead silence. You could hear people breathing, but nobody was talking. And the Reverend Lawson was leaning on the wall. He had his head back up and his eyes were closed. And I thought, oh my God, that is the bravest thing I've ever seen in my life. And the guy came back in and he had some other officers with him and he said, "There he is." And he said, "Mister, I'm telling you for the last time, you better get your back on the floor. We're not fooling around." And he said, "Again, I have to tell you, I'm in a great deal of pain, and I'd appreciate it if you'd let me stand." They started coming at him, and I inched up the wall. And they said, "What do you think you're doing, mister? You better get your back down." And I said, the bravest thing I ever said in my life. I said, "I'm standing with the preacher." And the whole room got up. And everybody said, "I'm standing with the preacher." And the guards got flabbergasted and angry and started yelling and left and slammed the door. This is what happened when I did it.
That's a beautiful.
That was my introduction to him, and my gratitude to him is enormous. I saw the kind of courage he had, and I thought, my God, he was in the middle of Memphis, and his dear friend was shot down in front of him, Reverend King, and he was with those workers saying, "I am a man." And he was there years before. And when I finally met him, he was here. He had a church down on the west side. And I'd see him every now and then, and I would just, the last time I saw him was at a mutual friend, and one of the great peacemakers here was Blaise Bonpane. I don't know if you know about him, but we had a memorial service, and Reverend Lawson came and spoke, and I spoke for a little bit. And he was not getting around easily anymore, and he was seated on the side, and I had a few remarks, and I came over and I just looked at him and I said, "Please give me the blessing." And I hugged him and he hugged me.
Yeah, when I saw him last Sunday, he lit up when I told him I was going to get to see you. So let me shift to another thing I want to raise with you. And I think it's related to what we've been discussing, but I want to go to the West Wing just a second.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
I think that my favorite scene, and I'm not just flattering you, but it's my favorite scene from television is the scene you do, President Bartlet does in the West Wing in the National Cathedral.
Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that scene encapsulates what people of faith at some point so often come to, not in spite of their faith, but because of their faith, when they're so frustrated at the brokenness of the world.
Yeah, okay.
Well, for those who haven't seen it, we'll note a link to it in the show notes so people can go watch it. And I watched it again last night, and I must say that I kind of flinched several times watching it because it's so. I mean, the president is, he's so angry and profane, and because of his grief, and then lights a cigarette and drops it on the floor and stomps it out in the middle of the National Cathedral. Yeah. But what does that kind of scene mean for you as a human being? Or did it mean much to you when you did that scene?
It did, I had, when I first came back to the church, there was a priest here, God rest him, Father Bud Kaiser, who was a Paulist father, and their mission is to reach the non-Catholic world. And so he had a mission here in Los Angeles, St. Paul's Church, and he founded a little film company, and they produced a series called Insight, and there were these little half-hour morality plays, so forth. That he had Sunday morning time, they'd give him. And so I became very close to him, and he became a great inspiration. I remember I came back to the church, I went to see him, and I told him I'm back. And he said, "This is just the honeymoon. You don't know what you're in for." And he was right. But he told me once that he would do that every so often, that he would get so frustrated with what he was trying to do with his life, and he just didn't seem to be getting anywhere, and God was not helping out. Thank you very much. And so he would lock up the church, literally, and have it out with God. How could you do this to me? I mean, he's like Job, or like Tevye. Tevye would say, "How could you do this to me?" On the other hand, it's that great thing where, we have the relationship that God becomes human, which transcends everything. I mean, that's the greatest change in the universe is that God becomes human, And so Bud Kaiser, talk to God like a human being. I'm mad at you today, and I got good reason, and you're going to hear every one of them, and so you better listen. And he would have it out. And I thought, wow. That's therapeutic, and it's theological, and it's Job, And so I thought of that. And so when I got the script, I thought, oh my God, this is what this guy is doing. He's going to have it out with God. And the only difference was Aaron Sorkin chose to have me do half of it in Latin. Well, I'd been an altar boy when I was young, and so I knew a lot of I knew how to kind of do the Latin, but I wasn't quite sure because there's a lot of differences in Latin. If you're German or Italian, there's a big difference in the Latin pronunciation. So I went to our parish priest here, Monsignor Sheridan, whom I told you has passed away now, but he's an Irish priest and a scholar. And so I learned the scene with him, the Latin portions. He told me how it would be done in the West. And so I learned it. And when I got to Washington, we shot it in the cathedral, and there was a lot of objection to it, not only because I was profane, but the cigarette, whoa, and some of the members of the hierarchy in the church were there, and they were not happy when we were doing that scene. And at one point during the break, I remember when we were doing covers, I did the master, and then we were doing covers, and I went back to sit down like in the middle, and some of them were not looking very happy. And I said, "You have some concerns about this scene?" "Oh, we do, but we were told to let you film here, and that's fine. We have no thing over." And I couldn't believe when I looked up, kind of what do I say about this? And if you look where I was standing, there was a stained glass of Job.
Oh my!
And I said, "Well, if you look up there, that's what I'm relating this to. It's Job. He's having it out with the Creator." Oh, they said, "Well, we didn't get that. What was it necessary about the cigarette?" And I said, "Well, I don't even smoke anymore, so I'm not thrilled about that. But they asked me to do it as a sign of disrespect or, despair." I said, "I guess it's both," and so I did it. And they came around, they got it. But I didn't have any hesitation doing it, and I learned it by rote. And when we got to the theater, I remember doing the master in one take.
Oh,
and I remember,
really?
Yeah. And after we did it, I went over just to relax a little bit in the dark. And Aaron Sorkin came over, and he just said, "Thank you." That's all he said. He said, and it was just like he didn't expect to say it. He didn't realize the power of the scene. He's not Catholic, and he when I agreed to do the character, I only asked for two things: that he be Catholic and that he have a Notre Dame degree.
which of course I liked. I like that part. Yeah.
Is that playing the dozens or what? I'm not saying I want it my way, but I want it my way. And that's what he said. And he was so moved by it. That's all he could say to me. He just said, "Thank you." And it was like he didn't realize how powerful it was. And I don't think any of us did.
Yeah. Well, we've got to get you out of here because you're on your way to Mass.
Yeah.
But so, last quick question.
Okay.
What's the Eucharist mean for you? You do this regularly, I take it.
Oh.
So
I was just at a funeral this morning, and as I went to the Eucharist. I think it comes from the Greek word. Is it celebration?
Giving of thanks.
Thanksgiving. Okay. Yeah. Well, it's so deeply personal. I was moved by my attorney, Joe Cosgrove, the guy I told you about, who's one of my heroes. I saw him recently, and we would go to Mass together a lot. And Joe, at communion, he would receive, and he would just go into he would sit. Most of the time you kneel after that, but he would sit, and he would just close his eye, and he would just go, and then I just look at his face, and he was like, he was somewhere deeply personal. And I began to realize that, if it's not personal, it's impersonal. In the Catholic Church, of course, we don't accept it as a representation. We really believe that in the transubstantiation, that it is not a representation of, but it is, in fact, in our dogma, it is Jesus himself who comes to us in the bread and the wine. And so just focusing on that, the prayer before communion is the most powerful. I barely can get it out. It's like, Lord, I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof, but only say the word and my soul shall be healed. And I say that so personally and so needfully and honestly. And it's like, you've called me here and I've come to see you again. And it's deeply, I'm very curious about how people pray. What do you see? What do you feel? How do you get there? Is it satisfying? Oh, and what keeps you coming back? For me, it is part of the community. You can't do it alone, and you shouldn't. You should worship together. But there, you bring all of yourself. You bring your family, your history, your health, your brokenness, your own personal brokenness. And I began to realize how important it is to recognize that the only way, it seems to me, that God can get in is through the broken parts, because that's when we're open. And so our brokenness is really a blessing. So it's blessed brokenness. And it's like, here comes the healing. This is it's recognizing God's presence in Jesus. And it's like, wow, one of my most fervent prayer is for the dying, people who are near death. And I pray that they will have and I pray for myself to have it too. Will I have the courage and confidence to say yes to the door when it's time to go in, And it's like Terah D. Chardin said, I don't know if I'm going to see the Son of God behind the door, but I believe I will. It's like Joe Cosgrove once told me, he's Notre Dame too, and he studied theology and law, he's a lawyer. But he once said, the only miracle that had no witnesses was the resurrection. That's the only really important one, because that's the one, if everyone saw it, then it wouldn't be a question of belief. It would be recognition. Of course, I saw him, Yeah, he was lying there 1 minute. Next minute, he got up and said, hallelujah, let's, celebrate. But no one saw it. Nobody saw it. And, there are two favorite passages in the gospel for me. Early in the morning on the first day of the week, the women. It's about the women, all those cowardly Men were all hiding. They were fearing the same fate as the master. But the women were out there in front. They were with him. And even when the master came back, first time they saw him, he didn't say, "Where were you when they were beating me?" And I didn't see a single one of you, save for the women, of course, but I didn't see it there. No, he said, "Peace be with you." Mm-hmm. He understands our brokenness, our fear, and that's what I just celebrate my blessed brokenness. And I say, and like that hymn, "Here I am, Lord. That's all I can bring today. Today I had a fight with so-and-so. Today I had I trashed so-and-so. Today I refused to accept somebody. Someday I was unkind. Today I did this, I did that. And I bring all that and I say, you know everything about me, and so do I. Mm. It's not just known to you. I know it too. I'm broken. Fix me," which is one of my favorite hymns. Mm. I was at a church in Atlanta one time, and it was still dark outside, early morning. Black Catholic church in Atlanta. And it was so beautiful. And there was a guy on piano in the sanctuary playing. And at communion, he sang, "Fix Me." Mm. And it's one of my favorite hymns, and I can't even sing it for you. But I just said, yeah, that's my communion prayer. Fix me. I'm broken. There you have it.
Been talking to Martin Sheen here at his home in Malibu. Thank you for your hospitality and your generosity with us today.
Lee.
Thank you.
It takes one to know one. I'm delighted to meet you.
Delighted to meet you. Thank you so much.
Peace be with you, brother.
Peace be with you, brother.
Thank you.
How do you find hope in dark times? Can you cultivate compassion even for your enemies? Life is full of big questions, and in a world that often seems like it's spinning out of control, finding answers can feel ever more urgent. But we humans have faced challenges before, and the solutions to many can be found in the wisdom of the world's spiritual traditions. Join me, Dave DeSteno, host of How God Works, a show about the science behind spirituality, as I look for answers. Listen wherever you find your podcasts.
Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carriet Harmon, Jason Sheasley, Ellis Osborne, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.